Good evening, friends. Welcome once again to the Friday evening webinar series, the unique PG track program by Delhi CSI. This is now the fourth month that we have entered with all your support and with blessings of our best and phenomenal teachers across the country. And this is the webinar 14th. And today we'll be discussing the oximetry and hemodynamic data interpretations, a stepwise approach. And we have none other than Professor Anita Saxena. Thank you so much, ma'am, for accepting our invitation. It's such a pleasure every time we hear to you. It's a great learning for hundreds and hundreds of residents and cardiologists who join across the country on this wonderful webinar. Again, as many of you have asked, what is our email? Our email is pgtrackcsI.delhibranch@gmail.com. If you have missed any of these sessions, please feel free to register to the website, which is free of cost YouTube channel, and you can get all the archives of 13 lectures that have been held on that particular channel. So you can easily subscribe to this channel, which is absolutely free of cost and only for you. Another very important thing, next slide, Mudit, please, that I would like to bring to your kind notice is, Mudit, next slide, please, that Indian Heart Journal has started a very unique initiative, a very wonderful initiative, that is a IAJ Thesis Awards. Now, this IAJ Thesis Awards I have already put in the group. All the final year fellows have a great opportunity to submit their IAJ Thesis Awards on the link, which we'll be sharing soon, either now or in the end of program again. And you can submit the paper for review, which will be a double-blinded review, and will go across to the experts, and you stand a great chance to win the awards by submitting. And you also have a chance of publication in the Indian Heart Journal or any other good index journal. So now over to our panelists. We have Professor Sumodh Kurian, who is Professor of Cardiology at GB Pant Institute of Postgraduate Medical Education and Research. We have also the pleasure of having Dr. Arima, who is Associate Professor of Cardiology with special interest in pediatric cardiology, who have joined us on this journey. And of course, my colleague, Professor Girish MP, and myself, Dr. Mohit Gupta, are there with you on this journey. On the outset, I would also like to make one very thing clear to you, that today we have few residents also on this journey with us on panel. They are representative of all of you, so that they will be able to interact on your behalf with madam and answer the question. So over to you, Dr. Sumodh and Dr. Arima, and look forward to a great session today.
As we all know, interpretation of oximetry data and hemodynamic traces is an important part of your exit exam. And ma'am, as one of the great, and she's very gifted in simplifying and teaching complex data and traces. And as you know, ma'am is the HOD of Pediatric Cardiology Department at AIMS, and ma'am has previously taught us some of the most difficult questions in congenital cyanotic heart diseases. And today, again, it is our great pleasure to have ma'am here to teach us the stepwise approach to cardiac cath traces and also to the oximetry data. Requesting ma'am to teach us.
Thank you, madam, for being around. We all have been listening to you on YouTube and in many other conferences. We always felt like Eklavas, but now today we have a chance to be Arjuns. So thank you, madam, and we would really be enjoying your presentation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sumodh, Dr. Arima, and special thanks to Dr. Mohit for organizing these seminars. I'm sure students really love these, and thank you again for calling me back on this. I would be very happy to be part of this journey that all the students are taking. And I think oximetry hemodynamics is something that most of them would be shown either a spotter or some questions will be asked. So I think it will be important. But I also want to emphasize that having this sort of a basic is very, very important in their career all through. So don't just take it from the examination point of view. I think you need to go very, very systematically whenever you are catheterizing somebody. And that is what I want to show you here. So some of it will be very much exam based, but a lot of it will be just to tell you how you should do it, further in your career whenever you are catheterizing a patient. So I would start sharing the screen and go to my slides. Are my slides visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So this is the topic, oximetry and hemodynamic data. So we'll be going, one by one. So I think let's start from the very basics. How do we go about catheterizing anybody? I think very, very important is that data must be obtained in steady state. If you have somebody who's got hypotension or arrhythmia, then whatever data you get may not have any value, and therefore your interpretation is going to be faulty. Whenever we go with a catheter, you must note where the course, how the catheter is going. Now, fortunately, now we have an echocardiography in majority of the structural heart disease patients that we see, and therefore catheter course is kind of predictable. But sometimes you do end up entering, those chambers or those vessels which you never thought you will. So whenever you're going, please note the catheter course, and that is best to do by taking pressures and oximetry samples from that particular chamber. Also try and take pressures and oximetry sample as close to in time as possible, because a lot of changes happen while you are catheterizing them, sometimes tachycardia, sometimes ectopics. So your pressures need to be correlated with the other chamber's pressure. Therefore, they should be taken very close in time as much as possible. And for that reason, having withdrawal pressures are always better than the ingoing pressures, because when you are withdrawing the catheter, then it is a very, very quick process. And therefore, try and take all the pressures while you are withdrawing, even if you've taken them while you were going in. Also, another important part that we sometimes tend to forget is that when you want to localize any obstruction, for example, aortic stenosis or pulmonary stenosis, please use an end-hole catheter. I know end-hole catheter cannot be used for angiography, but I think you should get into the habit of using the end-hole catheter if it is very, very critical for you to see whether the obstruction is at the valvular level or infundibular level or at both levels, and how much of it is at what level. Many a times we have faced this problem with valvular pulmonary stenosis, where you have a lot of infundibular hypertrophy and you tend to get some gradient at the infundibulum also. And I think it will depend whether you balloon dilate such patients or not, whether the gradient is primarily or predominantly at the valve level. And please don't be in a hurry to inject dye. Whenever you inject dye, remember it's a myocardial depressant. Therefore, you should try and take all the pressures, all the oximetry data before you start doing angiograms. So angiogram should be done towards the end of your study. Now, what are the parameters that we like to measure at cath? First is, of course, oxygen consumption. I think majority of the labs in India and even abroad are using assumed values. And these values have been derived from some tables that are available very, very freely in the literature. Then we should also try and measure all the pressures, right-sided chambers, left-sided chambers. In the right-sided chamber, we should try and go up to the pulmonary artery wedge. Many a times we don't do wedge, especially if you have an LA pressure available. But if you are really looking at things like mitral stenosis, etc., the pulmonary artery wedge is very, very important. And you must always take oxygen saturation from, or draw some blood and measure oxygen saturation and oxygen content from these chambers. So this is what we need to calculate. Fortunately or unfortunately, we have computer doing it for us now. But I think you should still know how these values are calculated. Very importantly, cardiac index. Then if you have a step up or a step down, then you have to find out what is the pulmonary blood flow, what is the systemic blood flow, what is effective pulmonary blood flow in cases who are desaturated. And then is it a left to right shunt, how much is the left to right shunt, and so on. The other important aspect that we calculate, especially when we are dealing with congenital heart defects like a large VSD, are the pulmonary vascular resistance and SVR. Very, very important to decide for operability. In fact, that is one of the major indications these days to catheterize anybody. Otherwise, we hardly ever catheterize people for diagnosis. We are doing it more for therapeutic purposes. And in cases where you are dealing with aortic valve stenosis or mitral stenosis, then we calculate the valve area. Again, it is important to know that you have to standardize calculation for body size, and that is why we use the word cardiac index and not cardiac output. And here is an example. If you have a body surface area of 0.5 in a child, then the cardiac output will obviously be very low, and therefore your cardiac index, if you don't measure cardiac index, your cardiac output is going to be much lower for somebody who has a surface area of 2, like a big man. So therefore you must adjust the cardiac output for body surface area and take cardiac index. Now, because we are assuming oxygen values, so most of the time the VO2 that you are assuming are already indexed, so you don't have to index it again. But you must remember to do that. We know that normal cardiac index varies from 2.4 to 4.4 liters per minute. And we also know that pulmonary blood flow, systemic blood flow, cardiac index are all same in somebody who does not have any congenital heart or a defect or a left to right or a right to left shunt. Just a couple of slides on some fundamentals before we go ahead. One is that we have to calculate oxygen content for the calculation of cardiac index, pulmonary blood flow, systemic blood flow, etc. And this we can do by knowing the hemoglobin and the oxygen saturation. The second thing is that in patients who are being given oxygen, whether it is being given for testing the reversibility in the lab for a large shunt, you must consider dissolved oxygen. Remember, oxygen content is equal to bound oxygen that you get from the content as well as dissolved oxygen. Again, if you have room air, if you're not giving oxygen, that is very negligible and you don't need to worry too much about it because it's not going to make much of a difference. But if you're giving oxygen and the PO2s are rising to 200 or even more, then the amount of dissolved oxygen content becomes very, very important. And if you don't do that, then you may get falsely wrong values. And I will show you a couple of examples later. So remember to add dissolved oxygen when you're doing oxygen study in anybody. And it is believed that you can have as much as 20% of error if you ignore dissolved oxygen, and therefore you may get, for example, PVRI may turn out to be very low, which is actually not the case. The other important thing that we tend to forget is to have the transducer level at the mid cardiac level or LA level, because if you have the transducer higher or lower, then you can introduce an error of 1 millimeters of mercury or something by just 1 centimeter. Now, these pressure differences may be very little for, let's say, ventricles, right ventricle, left ventricle, but when it comes to atrial pressures, then even 1 millimeter of mercury, or if you change it by 2 or 3 centimeters, will make a lot of difference in our interpretation of the result. So always check for the transducer. Each patient, you have to do that checking because each patient is different. Each patient's build is different. So you must adjust transducer every time you have a new patient on the table. These are the normal pressures. Right atrium has A, C, and V waves, X and Y descent. Right ventricular pressure should be under 30 systolic. Pulmonary artery is also about 30 to 10, 12. And then we have pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. So this is right-sided pressure. And on the left side, you have left atrium, which also looks like right atrial pressure. But the LV we know will be 120, 130 in an adult, and aortic pressure according. So this is how the waveforms should look like. And what we are interested usually in these cases is this end diastolic pressure, because when you're dealing with left ventricular dysfunction or you're dealing with mitral stenosis, etc., then end diastolic pressure becomes very, very important. Right and left atrial waveforms are pretty similar, except that LA pressure may be a little higher, and V wave in LA may be a little more than the A wave, whereas in right atrium it may be other way around. And atrial pressures are important because they give you an estimate of filling pressures. So please don't ignore atrial pressures. You must try and put your catheter in the right atrium, take pressure, wait for a while, and don't just push it into right ventricle and pulmonary artery. We also know that left atrial pressure is sort of represented by pulmonary artery wedge pressure because many a times we are not able to enter left atrium. So you use PA wedge pressure as a sort of surrogate marker of LA pressure. But remember, if you are trying to put or overlap PA wedge pressure with the left ventricular and diastolic pressure that you often do for mitral stenosis, you have to make adjustment for the delay. PA wedge pressure is somewhat delayed compared to left atrial pressure, and therefore when you are doing a superimposition, you have to account for that delay. Generally, LV-EDP, that is end-diastolic pressure of left ventricle, should be equivalent to LA pressure, should be equivalent to pulmonary artery wedge pressure. However, we all know that in patients with mitral stenosis or other forms of LV inflow obstructions, you may have a difference. In severe AR, for example, your LV-EDP may actually be higher than pulmonary artery wedge pressure because of premature closure of the mitral valve. So there will be various causes for this discrepancy, which we need to keep in mind. Another question that is often asked in the exam is, how do you ensure that you are in the wedge position? Because sometimes you may be partially wedge and you may be getting partly pulmonary artery pressure and partly wedge pressure. So generally, examiner expects you to say 4 things, that these 4 criteria if satisfied would make the pulmonary artery wedge pressure reliable. Well-defined A and V waves. Remember, pulmonary artery doesn't have A and V waves. Pulmonary artery has systolic and diastolic pressure. The catheter tip should be rather in the distal pulmonary artery and it should be fixed. When you're using a balloon tip catheter like a Swan gas, that you may not be very much in the periphery, but the tip will still be fixed because we know that we have wedged the catheter in the pulmonary artery branch. The saturation should be more than 90 to 93%, definitely more than 90%. And as soon as you withdraw a little bit, the pressure rises because then you are in pulmonary artery. So the first 3 are very, very important to say that this is a reliable pulmonary artery wedge pressure, because sometimes PA wedge pressure is very, very important, especially when you're dealing with LV inflow obstructions, etc. This is what normal oximetry in hemodynamics should be. These values are more for adults. In children, obviously, ventricular pressures and PA pressure and aortic pressure are going to be a little lower depending on the age of the child. But generally, if you have a good SVC saturation of 65-70%, you're going to get a good cardiac index of about 3 or 4. Saturation should be completely normal in left-sided chambers, about 70% in the right-sided chambers with no step up. Remember, IVC is little more saturated than the superior vena cava, and therefore you may get IVC saturation even up to 80%. That's not abnormal, but then there is a good mixing that happens in pulmonary artery, and you get saturation about 70% or so in the pulmonary artery. The end diastolic pressures correspond to the atrial pressures. But before I go further, I just want to highlight two things. One is that you may be wanting to get a lot of information at cardiac catheterization, but please never ever ignore patient's well-being while performing cardiac cath. So you should be carefully watching the patient the whole time while you are catheterizing the patient and trying to collect data. Don't be over enthusiastic. If you have a small child, please don't keep on taking samples, because each sample of 1 ml would mean producing too much of blood loss for a 3 kg child. Similarly, if you have an adult who's in heart failure, you have to be very, very careful. So please never ever ignore patient's well-being. Many a times we've done that we've done partial cath in one go because the patient looked sick, and then we brought back the patient and completed the cardiac catheterization. So there is no need to give extra risk to the patient. You have to remember that cardiac catheterization is an invasive procedure and can be fatal, more so in patients who are rather sick. Fortunately, we don't see this complication now because we get almost all the information by echocardiography, and only we focus on some information by angiography, and we don't go around, making the entire diagnosis by cardiac catheterization and angiography. So how do we check for the well-being of the patient? I think there are two parameters. In an acyanotic patient, superior vena cava saturation is a very good guide. In a cyanotic patient, or even in acyanotic, any desaturation, you have to take it very seriously. In fact, nowadays, almost all the labs will have an oximetry, non-invasive oximetry running all the time on the monitor, so that you know if the saturations are falling or not falling. You don't have to take the blood out every time to check it, because you can see it on the scope with a non-invasive pulse oximeter. Generally, if you have an SVC saturation of 70-80%, I think that would indicate that patient is doing well, has good hemodynamic reserve, his cardiac index is likely to be normal or near normal. But if you have an SVC saturation of 45-40%, I think you need to be very, very careful, because it would indicate little cardiac reserve. Please assess the patient again for adequacy of ventilation, fluid status, because many of these patients are fasting overnight, and then you do them next day at 4 o'clock in the evening because of the long queue that you have, or patient may be hypotensive, or they may be acidosis, etc. So you have to be careful if the saturations are low. And any arterial desaturation in an acyanotic patient should be considered serious, should always be considered serious. So if you have a patient, you started off as a VSD or a PDA, and you find that patient's saturation has dropped to 85%, please don't assume that this patient is now shunting right to left. Point is, why is this patient shunting right to left now? Similarly, if you have a mitral stenosis patient and the saturation drops to even 90%, I would be very worried, because that would indicate the patient might be going into pulmonary edema. Let's come to interpretation. How do we interpret pressure data? Many a times you will be in the exam, you will be given a pressure and oximetry data of a particular case, and then you will be asked to interpret it. So the first thing is to see whether the pressures are normal or abnormal. So you need to know what is normal RA pressure, what is normal LA pressure, what are the pressures that is considered as normal for pulmonary artery, and so on. Similarly, you should also know what is the normal end diastolic pressures in the ventricles. The next thing will be to link pressures. It is very, very important that when you're interpreting a pressure data, you must link the pressure to the next chamber. Considering that right atrium is connected to right ventricle to pulmonary artery, you must see that right ventricular end diastolic pressure should be equal to RA mean pressure or RA EA wave. Right ventricular systolic pressure should be equal to pulmonary artery systolic pressure. For example, if I write 20 millimeters of mercury RV systolic and 25 PA systolic, that's not possible. The blood can't flow like that. So you have to link these pressures. Yes, RV can be 40 and PA can be 20 because they could be pulmonary stenosis. Similarly, PA diastolic has to be linked to pulmonary artery wedge to be linked to LV diastolic pressure, and LV systolic to aortic systolic. So try and link these pressures, and this way you will get the gradients very easily. If there is mitral stenosis, you will find that wedge is higher than LVED. If there is aortic stenosis, you will find that LV is higher than aorta. So please link these pressures. That's very, very important. Look for gradients. Then you have to see if you have PA wedge or an LA pressure, what is the difference between RA and PA wedge? In a large ASD, you expect them to be equal. But if there is a good gradient, then please don't make a diagnosis of large ASD, even if there is a step up, because step up can be because of various reasons. The other thing that you need to see is LV pressure versus RV pressure, especially in patients who like tetralogy. You expect RV and LV pressures to be equal. Patients who have Eisenmenger syndrome, you expect RV and LV pressures to be equal. So do correlate the atrial pressure, do correlate the ventricular pressures. But again, as I said in the beginning, you can only do that if you have taken them in quick succession. For example, when you are taking aortic pressure, the child is crying. But when you are taking LV pressure, the child is quiet. So aortic pressure in that case is going to be higher than LV pressure, which is not a possibility. So you have to keep those things in mind. So this is how we generally believe that the gradient across mitral valve, any peak gradient or end-diastolic gradient is abnormal. Mean gradient of 5 is considered as abnormal. For tricuspid valve, the pressures are even lower, 1.9 for peak gradient. And for peripheral vessels, we generally take 20 as abnormal. For aortic and pulmonary valve, 25 as abnormal. This is how we generally classify pulmonary arterial hypertension, pulmonary venous hypertension. I'm sure all of you know these values, but I think the important thing to highlight here is that in case of children, again, you have to go by the systemic, but as a percentage of systemic pressure. So if you have a pressure of even 50 systolic pressure, but the aortic pressure is also 80, then that becomes severe or at least moderate pulmonary arterial hypertension. So you have to go in children by the systemic pressure as a percentage of systemic pressure. But in adults, these are the usual values that you need to remember for pulmonary artery hypertension as well as for pulmonary venous hypertension, which means pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. Diagnosis of shunt, again, another question that is often asked, how much step up is important? I think these are very, very old studies done on 25, 30 patients, but then these are the ones that we keep quoting all the time. Therefore, you probably should know these studies. If it is a single set, then your saturation step up has to be much higher. For example, 11% for atrial shunt, 10% for ventricular shunt, and so on. But if you have 2 sets or 3 sets, something that we very occasionally do these days, then the numbers come down. But overall, if you say 755 are important saturations as a cause of step up, then I think that should be sufficient. Any desaturation or a step down, that's very, very important. For example, your LA is 96, but LV has become 90. I think that is very, very important, and we have to take that seriously because it suggests right to left shunt. Now, what are the causes of step up at atrial level? I think another common question that you are asked when you are shown any oximetry chart and there is a step up at atrial level, then you are asked what are the causes. I think we all know the list, so I don't think I need to repeat that. Similarly, there are a number of causes for step up at ventricular level, but I think you should remember that even a low ASD can give you step up at ventricular level rather than like a primum ASD rather than just at the atrial level. So don't rule out ASD because the step up is coming at ventricular level. And similarly, you have causes of step up at great arterial level, PDA, AP window, PDA being the commonest. Again, an outlet VSD can give you a step up only at the great arterial level. So don't rule out a VSD if the saturation is increased only in pulmonary artery, because it depends from where you've taken the saturation in the ventricle. If you've taken from the apex, you may not get the step up at the ventricular level. You will have the step up at aorta or a PA level, even in a VSD cases. Yes, right to left shunt. Again, we have to see whether the LA is desaturated or pulmonary vein is desaturated. Then we have to think more in terms of respiratory pathology or even pulmonary edema. If there is a desaturation at the LA level, then we know it is ASD, which is shunting right to left. Therefore, you have to consider conditions like Epstein's, tricuspid atresia, severe pulmonary stenosis with tricuspid regurgitation, etc. Remember, even a large ASD, almost like a common atrium, can give you little desaturation at LA level without evidence of Eisenmenger syndrome. So a simple large ASD can also give you a little desaturation, but the overall saturation tends to be quite normal in majority of the cases. So the ultimate FA saturation may be almost normal, but yes, your LA may be a little desaturated in a very large ASD. If there is a desaturation at the ventricular level, you have to think about tetralogy or an Eisenmenger VSD. And if there is a desaturation at descending aorta level, then we know it is likely to be Eisenmenger PDA or a PDA with interruption or coarctation of aorta. How do we calculate cardiac index, QP, QS, QAP, QEP, etc.? Again, as I said, computer has taken over human mind, and therefore there are formulas and the residents have good time. But remember to put in the right value, because if you put in garbage, you're going to get out also garbage. So I have seen it happening very often that you don't put a right value and you get a very weird QP or a weird QS, and then you wonder why, what happened. So please go ahead and use these software that are available, but you have to be very, very sure that you are really putting the correct value and not messing it up, because if you put a wrong value, you're going to get a wrong report. Generally, mixed venous saturation, conventionally we say 3 SPC plus 1 IVC, but I think in reality we use mostly the superior vena cava, 1 superior vena cava saturation as a mixed venous saturation, and we generally assume pulmonary vein as 98% or so. If you're giving oxygen, then please assume it as 100%. But if you're doing oxygen study, like you're doing for operability assessment in a large PST, then you have to, as I said earlier, you have to bring in dissolved oxygen into consideration. So if you are calculating pulmonary blood flow, for the pulmonary vein oxygen content, you have to have the pulmonary vein oxygen content plus 0.03 multiplied by pulmonary vein PO2. If you have, let us say, 100 PO2, then this value becomes 3. So the content becomes the pulmonary vein content plus 3. If you have 200, then the content will become 6 plus the pulmonary vein content. So please don't ignore these PO2s or these dissolved oxygen in patients if you're giving oxygen for converting for testing the operability in any patient. And therefore you need basically PO2 values for 4 samples. One is pulmonary vein, the other is pulmonary artery, then superior vena cava and aorta. Pulmonary vein sometimes is difficult to get because you don't enter pulmonary vein in every case. In that case, we usually take it either equal to aorta or 250. That is an assumed value for calculation of pulmonary blood flow. So how do we quantify the shunt? Generally, we can very easily see, while in the lab only, the ratio between pulmonary blood flow and systemic blood flow, and that you can see by just having those saturation. You don't have to do any calculation for content. You have 4 saturation. You assume pulmonary vein is 98%, aortic saturation may be 98 or 100%, mixed venous saturation, pulmonary artery oxygen saturation. So this is what you take in the lab, and these values are available right there and then as soon as you are. So before you come out, before you decide to whether oxygen study is required or not, please make these calculations in the lab by asking for these 4 reports. Pulmonary vein if you have, otherwise 3 reports, that is SVC saturation, aortic saturation, and pulmonary arterial saturation. You can fairly well find out what is the QP-QS ratio. And if the QP-QS ratio is high, then we know that this patient is likely to be operable. Generally, it is believed that if the QP-QS ratio is less than 1.5:1, then it is considered a small shunt. And if it is more than 2:1, then it is considered a large shunt. We generally say if you can hear a good flow murmur, then it is a large shunt. Same thing in cath lab. If you're getting a QP-QS ratio more than 2:1, then it is generally considered a large left to right shunt, and anything between is moderate shunt. If your QP is coming less than QS, then you know you're dealing with a right to left shunt, and that will happen in cyanotic congenital heart disease. So I just show you an example. This is a large VSD where the SVC saturation is 68%, but there is a good step up at ventricular level with the PA saturation going to 88%. Aorta and pulmonary veins are well saturated, 98%. Can anybody tell me what is the QP-QS ratio here?
Yes, Abhimanyu, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. So QP by QS will be 30 divided by 10. Sir, 3:1.
Very good. That's perfect. So very easy. You put 98% minus mixed venous saturation, 98% minus PA saturation, it becomes 3:1. So you can do it right in the lab. And once you get a QP-QS ratio of 3:1 or something, you know that there is a large shunt, and this patient is likely to be operable. Of course, if the pressures are very high, if it's an old patient, you might still want to do oxygen study, but at least you have a fair idea that you're dealing with a large shunt. Generally, I think these are just little, pearls that you may say that QP should be more than QS in left to right shunts. QS is more than QP in right to left shunt. And when you are asked to quantify, many a times you will be asked, how much is the left to right shunt? You have to subtract QS from QP. Anybody wanted to say anything? Okay. Or if you have bidirectional shunt, then you have to use QEP or effective pulmonary blood flow. And I think I showed you the formula for that also. Now coming to the resistances, we have 2 values that we need to calculate, pulmonary vascular resistance and systemic vascular resistance. And we should do both because very often we use a ratio of PVR and SVR. So how do you calculate PVR? Pulmonary artery pressure mean minus left atrial or pulmonary artery wedge, whatever you have mean, divided by pulmonary blood flow. And for SVR, we use aortic mean pressure minus RA mean pressure and then divided by systemic blood flow, or QS. Now, pulmonary vascular resistance will be unreliable if you have discontinuous or peripheral pulmonary artery stenosis, because in those cases you will have differential flow. So there is a separate formula for that. But PVR calculation is very, very important for deciding the operability. We know that normal PVR should be under 3 Wood units, and normal SVR is generally 15 to 30, but there's a lot of variability in the SVR, whereas PVR is kind of fixed. It should not vary much between 1 and 3 Wood units. This is a patient, in fact, it's a child, and here you can see that the PA pressure is 71 as against 80. So there is obviously severe pulmonary arterial hypertension over here, but there is a good step up, and this is giving QPQS of 3:1. And if you see the calculated flows, then pulmonary blood flow is 8.8 and systemic blood flow is much less, and you get a ratio of about 3. Pulmonary resistance is 3.5. So despite the fact that patient has severe pulmonary arterial hypertension, even then the ratio is very good, and therefore the calculated PVRI is coming as 3.5. So there is really no need to check for reversibility in this particular patient, because the PVRI is low, number one. Number two, the QPQS is very, very high. So there is just getting a QPQ of 3:1 or something tells you that there is really no need for doing a pulmonary, doing an oxygen study or a pulmonary vasodilator reversibility testing. But if the PVR is high, I think we all know that we have to check for reversibility in the cath lab, and that is one of the main indications these days for taking children or even adults with congenital heart disease to the lab, like a large VSD or large ASD. So we have various agents like sildenafil, nitric oxide, but I think none of them have, or even 100% oxygen, none of them have shown to be of great value, but we are somehow used to using 100% oxygen. We give it for 10 minutes. And then we look for the change in patient's hemodynamics. And what should happen is there should be fall in diastolic and mean PA pressure. Remember, systolic pressure is unlikely to fall because you have a large communication between RV and LV. And therefore, the pressures in the systole are not going to be much different. And therefore, you don't expect systolic pressures to fall. You expect diastolic and the mean PA pressure to fall if there is a good response. There should be increase in pulmonary blood flow. That means the pressure, the oxygen step up in the pulmonary artery should rise, and the calculated PVR is going to be lower. Very often the pulmonary artery wedge also rises because of large pulmonary blood flow, and that further reduces the PVR because the formula says PA minus PA wedge. If PA wedge rises, then the pulmonary vascular resistance falls. But again, please be very careful and consider dissolved oxygen when you are using 100% oxygen for calculation, because otherwise you will underestimate PVR. So if you don't use dissolved oxygen, your PVR will be falsely low, which is not good because you will send the patient for surgery, whereas patient may not have been operable. So very often you will be asked what is the cutoff for the PVR value to decide whether the patient can be operated or not. I think it's a very complex issue. I will not go into detail because that's really beyond the scope, but a lot depends on patient's age. If you have a PVR of even 8 in a child who's 1 year old or 9 months old, I would be, rather be sending him for surgery. Whereas if I have a PVR of 7 in a 15-year-old, I'll be very, very worried and I would probably not send him for surgery. So I think it depends a lot on patient's age. If it is more than 6, then I think it's a cause of concern. And this is after giving 100% oxygen. So this is after testing for pulmonary vascular reactivity. We also use parameters like PVR-SVR ratio of less than 0.3. But generally, 6 to 8 is quite a gray zone. And of course, more than 10, I would be very, very sure that this patient is not operable and will not go for surgery. But generally, if the problem arises, the gray zone is more like 6 to 8 Wood units. And there you have to take everything into consideration, including RP-RS ratio, including the patient's age, X-ray, chest, ECG, showing left ventricular forces, and so on. So we, that discussion can go on. But none of this is really very exact. You can just try and come to a sort of a scoring system where you can take a call whether to operate or not. But I think important thing to remember is that if you have too much doubt about operability, it is better not to operate, because if you operate, then you actually convert these patients from Eisenmenger syndrome to primary, almost like primary pulmonary arterial hypertension, and then they do much worse. So therefore, if you are reasonably certain that this patient is not likely to be operable, better not to operate, you can try giving pulmonary vasodilators and maybe recheck this patient after a couple of months if you're doubtful, but better not to operate in such patients. Valve area, I wouldn't touch much on it. I think you all know the formula for mitral valve area and aortic valve area, and we do it often in patients of PTMC at least. So this is a simultaneous PA wedge and LVEDP trace. I think there are two things I want to highlight here. One is that you must do it at a high speed. Don't do it at 25 millimeter per second speed. Please make it 100 so that you get very good points. And also do it at a very low scale so that your PA wedge comes up. So you can see the scale over here is very low, and that's why you don't see LV systolic pressure, because the scale is, I think, 40. But you can see the PA wedge and LVED points very well, and you know that there is no gradient over here. So this is what is PA wedge plus LVEDP tracing, something that you do almost, very often in patients of PTMC. This is typical mitral stenosis. You have a high PA wedge and you have a significant gradient across the mitral valve, or LV inflow, I would say, which is producing this gradient between PA wedge and LVEDP. This is a patient who has a very tall V waves. I think you can see that very tall V waves, and that would suggest that this patient has acute, or this patient has MR, perhaps acute MR, because V waves are really very, very loud and very, very tall, and this happened because of the post-PTMC mitral regurgitation. So when you are again doing balloon valve, mitral valvotomy, you are on the lookout for PA wedge pressure, whether the V waves have become tall or not. Of course, now we depend a lot on echocardiography also. So this is a quiz for you. This is a 28-year-old lady with history of rheumatic fever. Echo shows severe mitral stenosis, but when you look at the LA and PA wedge trace, you see no mitral stenosis. Why should that happen? You have the pressure data and oximetry on the side.
Can anybody answer? Would like to unmute and attempt?
Ma'am, this is likely because of very low cardiac output. As we see, SV saturation is 53% only, and probably because of very low flow across the mitral valve, there is not much gradient.
Okay. Anybody has any better idea?
Ma'am, there is a significant step up from SVC to RA, suggesting a large ASD.
Yes, that's right. I think there is you can see a huge step up from right atrium, from SVC to right atrium, suggesting
large ASD.
So remember, when there is a large ASD, you may not have any gradient across the mitral valve. And when I say echo showed mitral area of 0.6, that would not be by pressure half time, because pressure half time will again not show much gradient, and you have to actually look at the mitral area by planimetry to see whether mitral area is stenosis, there is stenosis or not. So in patients of large ASD, you can very easily miss mitral stenosis at cath, even at echo sometimes if you are doing pressure half time only. So you have to be careful, and you should be doing it in the short axis, looking at a mitral valve planimetry. So this is quite usual not to have any gradient or have very little gradient despite severe mitral stenosis in a patient who has a large shunt, because it's the shunt is sort of taking away the gradient in a way. Okay. This is another trace of pressure from the left ventricle. This is retrograde aortic as is seen here. This is from the literature, from one of the reports. This is left ventricle to aorta, using a right coronary catheter for pressure recording.
And here we can see that once the catheter is being withdrawn from the LV, once it reaches the LVOT, we can see a systolic gradient that is existing. And once it reaches into the aorta, so between LVOT and aorta there is no gradient, but between the LV cavity and the LV outflow tract there is a gradient. And the wave pattern is a typical spike and dome pattern that is seen in HOCM.
Yes, very good. I think very well said. So firstly, it is a subvalvular gradient. And the second thing is that the pattern suggests that of hypertrophic obstructive cardiomyopathy. Another one. This is again LV to aorta.
Yes. This is a pullback tracing, ma'am, from LV into the aorta. Initially, we could see that with the pullback from the LV into the aorta, we could see the systolic pressure maintained and diastolic pressure, and further pullback leads to drop in the systolic pressure.
Right.
This indicates that probably there is a stenosis somewhere above the valve level, supravalvular aortic, supravalvular stenosis. Yeah.
Absolutely perfect. This is supravalvular aortic stenosis. So you can only get these ideas if you're using an end-hole catheter. If you're using a pigtail, you're going to miss all this. And that is why I said if you want to know the gradients, please use an end-hole catheter. Another one.
Anybody else, please?
This is LV and left brachial artery. It's actually labeled here. This is aortic pressure and this is
Sakshi is there. Please, Sakshi is there. Please, yeah, go ahead.
So we can see, the LV pressure is almost same and in the entire tracing, but we can see that the left brachial artery pressure is changing. Was low initially and now it is in later half it is better. So simultaneously we can see in the ECG that the initial part of the trace shows junctional rhythm and the later part shows sinus rhythm. So most likely because of and also the brachial artery trace shows a spike in tone pattern. So most likely HCM, which initially had junctional rhythm and then sinus rhythm, which improved.
Yes, I think you've said it well. Generally, in fixed aortic stenosis, you don't have so much of difference between junctional and sinus rhythm. But here, because you are, in HCM, atrial kick is so important that if it goes away, then the aortic pressure just drops down. So there is still a gradient in sinus rhythm also, but the gradients are much better. The pulse pressure is improved quite significantly. That is again quite suggestive of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy from junctional rhythm to sinus rhythm. This one is simple.
The pressure tracings of the RA, we can see that there are prominent X and Y descents after the C wave and V wave. So prominent X and prominent Y descent, the diagnosis can be restrictive pericarditis.
I think one very important thing that you should say is that the RA pressure is high. If you have prominent X and Y descent and RA pressure is not high, that doesn't make it CCP. So the first thing should be that your RA pressure is actually quite high, as you can see. It's about probably 18 or something. But of course, there are prominent X and Y descent, which makes it quite specific for the CCP. But also the pressures are high. Another one.
Go ahead, Anthony.
So the flow.
Yes.
Here you can see that there is a prominent A wave, giant A waves with a RA pressure normal with prominent Y descent. So X descent is absent. A and C waves are under 20. So with a prominent prominent Y descent.
Are we sure that this is Y?
After V wave, I don't see this. There is tachycardia. The RA pressure is a little raised. And if we see it in line with the R wave of the ECG, we can see that the wave the positive wave that is prominent is actually the A wave that is followed by a small C wave. Once a V wave comes, there is no Y descent. So this is absence of Y descent.
Right. So this is in contrast to the CCP. Here you have cardiac tamponade. So what happens? X becomes sharp and the Y descent disappears. But I agree this should have been taken at a higher speed to be very clear which is A, which is V. But the pattern looks like that of a pericardial effusion, cardiac tamponade, unlike the previous one which you saw. So one of them is CCP, one of them is restrictive cardiomyopathy.
In the first one, we can see that there is a interventricular dependence with inspiration. We can see that the RV and systolic pressure is high, and the LV and during expiration, you can see that the LV systolic pressure is low and the RV is high. It's suggestive of a interventricular dependence, as well as you can see the end diastolic pressure of both RV and LV merging with each other, which shows a square root sign. while in the other one, we don't see an interventricular dependence, which is, so the first picture is more suggestive of CCP, and the second one is more of an RCM.
Yes, I think very, very important. Why I wanted to show is because very often you are asked in the exam about the differences between pericarditis, CCP and district cardiomyopathy on cath. And, we talk about all those differences within 5 millimeter and then PA systolic pressure more in district cardiomyopathy compared to CCP. All those features can overlap. But I think ventricular interdependence, if you can get, sometimes it's difficult to get, but if you can get, that's a very, very specific sign to differentiate these two conditions. So I think this is what you have to keep in mind. Okay. This is simple. This is from pulmonary artery to RV.
You can see the gradient after the RV OTM. This one is probably infundibular PS.
Okay. So I think this is important to know that this is RV. This is not pulmonary artery. Why it is not pulmonary artery? These two beats?
Because the diastolic pressure.
Yes. So diastolic is almost touching zero over here, right? So PA diastolic will not touch zero. So this is RV pressure trace, and then you suddenly get an RV inflow. This is very, very suggestive of infundibular pulmonary stenosis. Again, you must be using an endole catheter to say that. If you don't use endole catheter, then you can get a hybrid trace, and therefore you're going to miss it. On the other hand, this one is very typically valvular PS, where you have just one level of gradient over here from pulmonary artery to the RV. There is a significant gradient that you can see. This is, I think, quite clear. This is coarctation of aorta. I wanted to show you that the pressures fall when you go across a coarc, but it is a systolic pressure. See, the diastolic pressure is the same. So it is only a fall in systolic pressure, and the pulse pressure obviously becomes much less. And that is pretty classical of coarctation. Unlike the supravalvular AS trace that I showed you earlier, where you have both systolic and diastolic pressure, and the trace remains, it doesn't become damp like this. In supravalvular AS, the trace remains, the trace has a good pulse pressure in the aorta, even beyond the obstruction. So this is quite classical of coarctation of aorta. I think this is something that you're often shown in the exam, but I want somebody to explain what is this broken baroque response or phenomena, or broken baroque Moro phenomena. What components are there in this phenomenon?
Hello. Yeah.
Yes, Samir. Or Shravan, please be louder.
Yes, yes. Ma'am, here we could see a VPC, ma'am. Following the VPC, we could see the drop in the aortic pressure as well as increase in the LV pressure, ma'am. The gradient across the LV as well as aorta has increased post VPC, which suggests there is a dynamic obstruction in the LVOT that has caused this response.
And another important thing will be, ma'am, that the pulse pressure has narrowed after the.
Absolutely. I think that is what I wanted somebody to say, that post extrasystolic, not only the gradient has increased, gradient will increase even in a static or a fixed subvalvular AS. It is the pulse pressure of the post extrasystolic aortic pressure that will be less. So I think that is what is important, to call it a broken baroque phenomena and to be specific for aortic stenosis. And here I show you an example of fixed aortic stenosis, where you can see that the pulse pressure has actually not gone down. In the post, the gradients have increased, the post extrasystolic LV pressure has suddenly shot up, and therefore the gradients have increased, but the pulse pressure has remained the same. So this is more like a subaortic membrane or some sort of a fixed aortic stenosis. So when we talk of HOCM with PVC, I think it is imperative that we say that the pulse pressure also is narrower in the post extrasystolic aortic pressure trace. Anybody wants to talk about this?
Anybody else?
This ventricularization of the LCA pressure. So probably.
Who's that?
Sai Krishna.
Sai Krishna. Okay, okay.
So while we're trying to hook the LCA, we can clearly see the ventricularization of the pressure. There's a drop in diastolic as well as systolic. So probably left main stenosis or spasm.
Yes. So very, very important. What should you do, Sai, if you see
immediately pull back?
Yes. I think that is very, very important, that you must think of left main coronary artery disease. Even if you feel that it may be wedged or something, please take it out immediately, and then you can always repeat it. So you can see prominent A wave also in that trace. So important not to get into any complication. Once you see this, please come out. This is for somebody from Pant Hospital, because I think we just had this trace shown last week in one of our meetings.
Abhimanyu, Shravan, Anthony, anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah. So the wave that is of, there are actually, sir, two waves. One is occurring in the systolic period and one is occurring in the diastolic period. Since the diastolic wave is of higher amplitude, so it is probably of an assisted device assisted circulation.
Very good.
Which is leading to diastolic augmentation.
Absolutely. Very good. I think this is very, very important to see which part of cardiac cycle the higher wave is coming. If you don't see that, then you miss it. So therefore, it is important to know that the pressure in diastole is higher than systole. It can only happen in one situation, which I think we all know, IABP, or when you assist. Then this is 1:1 assistance, as you can see over here. Okay, now we have some oximetry and pressure data to interpret. I think anybody can take it, and then the next one can be taken up by the other person.
Yes, Sakshi.
So this patient clinically is acyanotic. He has a white split second heart sound with a flow murmur at the base. There's a significant step up from SVC to RA. The AVO2 difference is normal, so patient has good cardiac reserve. There's no further step up. So it's most likely a atrial septal defect. The RA and the pulmonary PA pressure is normal. There's a step 20 millimeter mercury pressure gradient from RV to PA, which might be because of high flow. And PA wedge shows so it's a ASD.
Is it?
What more important?
Gradient between RA and PAWP.
LA and RA pressure are different.
You don't have LA pressure over here, but you have a PA wedge pressure. And PA wedge ideally should be equal to RA if there's a large ASD, uncomplicated. So therefore, that would be something that you should not expect in a large ASD, because there is a large step up, so it can't be a small ASD. You have a step up about 13%, so it cannot be a very small ASD to say that it is more like a PFO and therefore there is a gradient. But the step up suggests that there is a large shunt, all right, and therefore when you say difference between RA and LA pressure of so much, 1 or 2 millimeters is acceptable, but when it goes to 10 millimeters, 5 millimeters or something, that's unacceptable in a large ASD, and therefore one has to think of a partial anomalous pulmonary venous drainage. It is possible that there is a PFO or something in addition, because that's usually associated, but large ASD is unlikely with this pressure data. Okay, somebody else?
There is there is systemic desaturation, so the child is cyanotic. Now we can see that the saturation data in all the 4 chambers of the heart are same, and there is a large difference between the IVC saturation and SVC saturation. Whereas normally we see that SVC saturation is lower. So here, this means that there is a step up at the SVC level, and that is this is an admixture physiology that is leading to the same saturations in all the 4 chambers. So this is most likely a supracardiac PAPVC. Now coming to the pressure data, there must be an AST for this admixture to happen, and since the pressure between the RA and LA are both same, so it is a non-restrictive AST.
Yes, and there is hardly any PAH, practically, or very minimal PAH, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
Can you tell which type of ASD?
Non-restrictive supracardiac TAPVC with non-restrictive AST.
Yes. So supracardiac TAPVC, I think this is the saturation that is almost equal and typically described. Also, it's a 12-year-old boy with an ASD finding. So if you have anybody who's sort of behaving like an ASD or finding like an ASD but is minimally cyanosed, you have to keep that in mind, and therefore should think about total anomalous pulmonary venous connection. The commonest type at that age is supracardiac. Okay. Dr. Mohit, do we have some time?
Yes, ma'am. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Okay.
Please go ahead. There's more than 600 people here enjoying. Anybody can attempt this? Anybody else?
I've given you the diagnosis. It's a patient, 23-year-old with a large VSD, pulmonary artery hypertension. It's quite sick, as you can see. And we just took him for cath to decide whether he's operable or not. Given you the calculated data also.
Ma'am, because it is a large non-restrictive VSD, so we expect a step up at the RV level, but here we can also see that there is a step up at RA level, and once we see the pressure data, the V wave in RA is showing large pressure. So this may be a concurrence of VSD with significant TR. That is causing a step up at RA level.
Yes. Anything else?
Anything else?
Should I send patient for surgery? Or is there anything else that you want to point out in this data? Patient is sick. Patient is in almost failure, as you can see that PA wedge is 23, RA is 14. So patient is obviously pretty sick.
There is a gradient between PA wedge and LV EDP, so LV inflow obstruction can be.
But there is severe MR also, so that can give you some mean variance. I think what I want you to know over here is this. So this case is very easy. I've given you the diagnosis, everything. So I'm not really looking at whether patient is operable or not. The important thing is look at QS. It's just 1.6, which is what is going into his body, not QP. The second thing is look at his saturation. So what I did, after that, I didn't even do any angio for this patient. Because if I had done an angio, his wedge would have risen to almost, I mean, it's already 23. So how much more, he'll become very sick. I remember this patient we took with, great difficulty because we tried to stabilize him clinically as much as we could. And we had to get data because this fellow is 23 years old, whether he's operable or not was a question. And he was in heart failure, he had TR, he had MR, he is in atrial fibrillation, as you can see. But I just took the pressure data, oximetry data, and never did any angio because you can always look at the VSD by echo. So this is where I think your exam mode should be over and you should really look at these things more critically when you are catheterizing on your own. Nobody is there to supervise you. You are the one responsible for everything with this particular patient. And I think you should be worried if you see an HbC of 41. I told you that it is suggestive of a very low reserve that this patient has, and you have it right in front of you, QS of 1.6. So please pay attention to these things while you are catheterizing anybody, more so when you are catheterizing sick patients. And I think you may not have cardiac index at that time, but you definitely can look at the SPC, whether it is looking so dark. Many a times you just draw SPC and you find it to be almost black, and that should worry you that what's going on. So if you have done angio in this patient, I'm sure you would have made him worse without giving an additional information. So I think at that point in time, it's best to just stop. The data that you have is enough to decide whether he can be operated or not. And you can look at the VSD by various means, including echocardiography, if required, even a transesophageal echo during the operation time in the OR. But please be careful when you're seeing such patients. So that was the idea of showing the slide and not really to get the diagnosis. So this is a 3 years old, cyanotic, clinical diagnosis of tetralogy, anything unusual, or it is straightforward tetralogy.
Anybody else?
Ma'am, there is when the RB pressure is systolic is 120, whereas the LB systolic is 90. So it suggests a restrictive VSD, top is a restrictive VSD.
Very good. I think, again, you must see how desaturated he is, 65%. So he's quite blue. And for him, it's probably the systemic pressure is obviously 90. It is the RV which is suprasystemic. And I think you might be asked during this time, what are the causes of restriction of VSD in a tetralogy of fellows? And you should know the various mechanisms by which the VSD can get restricted. But this was actually taught with restrictive VSD, quite straightforward. Another one. 3-year-old, cyanosis since birth. Somebody else other than Sakshi and Samir.
Here we can see that coming to the systemic saturation, the SVC is 56. The aortic saturation is 70, but the PA saturation is 88. So PA saturation is more than aortic saturation, suggestive of transposition physiology.
Okay.
Along with the RA RA pressure mean is 6 along with the RV pressure 95, that is followed by LA and RA mean is equal. So transposition with the AST.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there a VST?
Then PST 95. There is no VST.
Why do you say that?
The pressure difference between RV and LV is 95 and 42, and the saturation when we see it is RV 67 and LV 87 with the mild step up from RA to RV. So with the considering step up from RA to RV with the pressure difference.
Why LV pressure is only 42?
Because in transposition, LV is giving to the PSO.
Yes, that is what is important. I think you may write it RV, PA, LA, LV, but actually it is the LV which is supporting PA and it is the RV which is supporting aorta. So you're going to get these pressures. Now, when you have a difference of 95 and 42, you don't expect at least a sizable VSD. There could be a small VSD, but virtually it's like an intact ventricular septum, right? And there is going to be an ASD because this is a 3-year-old child who has survived to this age, number one. Number two, his saturations are not too bad. For a transposition, having a 70% saturation is reasonable. For a tetralogy, it is low. So when you have a saturation of 70%, you expect that this patient will have a sizable ASD. So transposition with intact ventricular septum and an ASD. Of course, no sizable PDA also for the same reason, because your pressures in the aorta and pulmonary artery are very, very different. This is a 20-year-old patient who's become class 3 over the last just 3 months. What do you think is happening to him?
Anybody ready to take it?
One can just read it and then, need not give a diagnosis, just interpret it.
So the AVO2 difference is very high. The patient has is very compromised, has a low cardiac output. We can see that the atrial pressures, the RA mean as well as the PA wedge pressure, both are high. Both the ventricular EDs are high, and we can see that in the FA pressure, the diastolic pressure is very low. So the patient has severe AR with LV dysfunction, with heart failure.
You don't want to look at the saturations at all.
Sorry, saturation. There is a step up from
huge 40%
RA to RV, so it's acute RSOV to RV.
Yes. So you want to still consider AR?
No, ma'am, it's RSOV.
Right. So if you don't look at the oximetry, this is what happens. So you have to look at everything. Huge step up from 50 to 90%, and you have a wide pulse pressure. Yes, wide pulse pressure by itself could be AR, but why should you have so much of step up? Usually when there is VSD-AR, because the other differential diagnosis could be VSD-AR, that you have a step up and you have a low pulse, wide pulse pressure. But remember, such high pulmonary artery wedge pressures, such high PA pressures are very unusual, because when there is AR with VSD tends to get smaller, and therefore PA pressure is likely to be normal. So if you have such a high wedge, if you have such a high PA pressure, it is unlikely to be just a straightforward VSD with AR, because VSD would be not so big. And also the history is quite short. The patient has become class 3 in such a short time. So I think you should think about RSOV to right ventricle. Okay, I think we are almost done. So this is a 16-year-old large VSD, severe pulmonary arterial hypertension. We took the patient for CAT to test for operability. I'll give you some calculated parameters. This is in room air, and this is on O2. Anybody has a question for me before interpreting?
Sir, madam, whether a dissolved oxygen is...
yes, very good.
Whether
Who
it
said
is
that?
Anthony.
Very, very good, very good. I think that is very, very important, because if you don't use the, the software, or if you use a software which does not usually have dissolved oxygen into country, to concentration. Of course, now we have software which does that. But if you don't do that, then this is what happens. Your PVR is only 6.4 and you tend to think, okay, this patient seems to be operable because he has a good step up. His QPQS has risen to 3.2 on O2 and PVR SVR ratio is 0.22. So 3.2 QPQS, 6.4 PVR, PVR SVR 0.22, likely to be operable. But then if you look at the dissolved oxygen, you consider that in the calculation, your QP falls down to 6.8 and therefore PVRI goes up to 10. And obviously he becomes, I would say he's inoperable. I think even if we look at the basal data, the very fact that he's showing a step down from 98% or let's say 95% to 93% is a very, very critical finding that you should not ignore. Any desaturation in a patient who's awake and is not sedated, because he's a 16-year-old, so hopefully he's not been sedated, is to be taken very, very seriously. So this fellow is actually inoperable. So I'm going to just finish to give you maybe 1 or 2 slides. One is, what are the sources of error in the cardiac cath lab? Something that you have to always keep at the back of your mind. I told you about the transducer level. I think you need to see how your pressures look like, whether they are underdamped or they're overdamped. So you have to deal with it accordingly. Sometimes you're in a hypertrophic ventricle like an RV, you can wedge your catheter, especially the end-hole catheters, or even a multi-purpose where your pressures may become very high with a tall peaking. Use of multi-hole catheter for withdrawal gradient should not be done, and therefore you should not try and interpret such pressure data especially for gradients. Sometimes when we are doing oximetry, there could be air bubbles, so you have to ensure that there is no air bubble. After you've taken the sample, make sure that the air bubble has been thrown out. Syringe should be empty. It should not have any saline, heparinized saline that you often use, and also samples to be sent quickly for analysis. If you delay the samples, again, your oxygen is going to be higher. Very often we are forced to use machines which use AVG and not co-oximeters. And when we use AVGs to estimate oxygen saturation, that again can be fallacious. Then of course, we are almost always assuming VO2 values, which is something that may vary from person to person and may not be correct, especially when you're doing it on oxygen study. When we are using it on oxygen study, then these assumed VO2s may not be valid. Also, we are assuming pulmonary venous oxygen saturation. And if you don't account for dissolved oxygen, especially during an FiO2 of 100 or 1, then you should be, you will be underestimating the PVR value. And again, please make all measurements during stable hemodynamics. If there are arrhythmias, if there's acidosis, if there's hypoventilation, then all these features are going to affect the pressures as well as oximetry. For example, if there is any amount of hypoxia, the PA pressure is definitely going to rise, and you may think the patient has severe pulmonary arterial hypertension. So to end, the oximetry and pressure data must be serially recorded and systematically interpreted in the light of clinical information. Please have as much data as you can prior to putting catheter in anybody, so that your study is focused and your study interpretation is better once you've done the cardiac catheterization. If you have any unexpected finding, please verify it by repeating that measurement, because sometimes you do have surprises on the table. Do analyze oximetry data for any step up or step down. Try and link pressures of a chamber to the chamber next in line. Whenever you're giving a data sheet, please do that and look for any gradients. Atrial pressures to end-diastolic pressures of the ventricles, and systolic pressures to systolic pressures in the great artery. Compare pressures of RA and LA or PA wedge, otherwise you will miss the diagnosis of an ASD. Compare RV with LV to know whether there is a VSD or not, or is it restricted. Thank you. Any questions? I'm happy to answer.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such a fantastic presentation. Over to Dr. Arima and Dr. Sumodh and Dr. Girish for any comments and questions.
Thanks, madam, for such a nice and lucid presentation. There is one question that from where should we take PA samples in case of assessment of AP window or PDA?
So I think for any PDA or AP window, it is better to go into one of the branches. Ideally would be for a PDA, for example, ideally would be to go into LPA and RPA and take a mean, because we know that PDA tends to have more flow from aorta into LPA. So that would be ideal. But I think very often we are happy to take it one of the branches, either RPA or LPA, or in the case of AP window also, we should try and take it into one of the branches. I think that would be ideal to calculate the QPQS, because then you have real mixed sample.
And one more thing, many a times when we are doing reversibility studies, we get PA, post-oxygenation PA saturations like 97, 98%.
Yes,
and
yes.
that becomes very weird. Like
Yes.
from 1.1, it becomes 13:1, 14:1.
Right.
Then is there any credibility to that data? This occurs even despite multiple revisions. So what should be our interpretation in that case?
I think you are absolutely right. The saturations look really weird, and therefore, if you interpret that, then you're going to get something like a QP of infinity or something. But I think the moment you take away you include dissolved oxygen, because the PO2s are going to be quite high, then the real values shows up, and those values are reasonably good, or let's say they look more realistic. But having said that, I think we all know that 100% oxygen has a lot of fallacies. I think for want of having an alternative, we've been doing it time and again. We've been saying they're quite useless, but still we are using it. I think there are a lot of fallacies, and people should start using alternatives like sildenafil or nitric oxide if you have that. But nitric oxide is again, is a huge issue. To deliver nitric oxide is a big issue. But because we don't have anything better, we are using 100% oxygen. But you're absolutely right. Your PA saturations, even SV saturation sometimes goes up to 85, 86%. Which is very, very unrealistic. But I think when you calculate content and when you take the dissolved oxygen into consideration, generally the values that you get after that are more realistic. I mean, probably more close to realistic, not still normal, but more close to realistic.
And one more question, madam, while assessing reversibility in case of PDA, suppose we are using a balloon. So nowadays, usually compliant balloons are not available. So what are we using? Number one. Number two, it is very difficult to stabilize the balloon in that condition. So what is the method to stabilize the balloon? And another thing, what you people at AIIMS are using in the absence of compliant balloon availability?
So I suppose your question is to find out whether the patient is operable or not?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think you are absolutely right. We used to do balloon occlusion, and we've reported also this in many years ago. Firstly, we don't know whether what is the sort of endpoint to say whether this patient is operable or not by balloon occlusion. And secondly, as you said, balloon, to keep the balloon in PDA sometimes becomes very difficult. It either slips into aorta or it comes back into pulmonary artery, so that becomes a big problem. So I think of late what we've been doing is that, considering that this patient is likely operable, we sometimes put a device and occlude with the device without releasing it, and then keep taking the pressures. And if we find that the pressures are falling and staying low, then we would release the device. Otherwise, we would take the device. I know it's not the right thing to do because you might be wasting a device, but generally this is the procedure that we do in those where we feel that it's very likely that this patient will be operable, and therefore we are probably not going to waste this device. But if you have a doubt whether this patient is likely to be more likely to be inoperable, then I think you'll be ending up wasting a device. So that is the problem. But balloon occlusion is something that we still do. I wouldn't say we don't do. I think we've done some in the last 1 year also.
What balloon is in use there? Because compliant balloons are not available now.
So we have been using the usual balloon that we use for balloon dilatation, for example, Taishak balloon. And we confirm by making sure that there is no step up after the balloon occlusion has been done. Sometimes we check by some hand injections or even by echocardiography that we are not blocking the aorta, we are not blocking the pulmonary artery. So for example, if you want to use 12 millimeter into 3 centimeter or 10 millimeter into 2 centimeter balloon, that can fit in within aorta. We also have used the Fogarty balloon sometimes in smaller children, which is the one we use for septostomy. That is another one that one can use. Sometimes it can go from aorta into the pulmonary artery, and that is a circular balloon, and it's quite good in the sense of blocking the PDA. But yes, I think it is a problem. But sometimes we've used devices, and before leaving it, we just check all the pressures.
For how long? For how long do you keep the device there? Means like,
so the rule, I mean, whatever published literature is to say that you keep it for 5 minutes. You look for a fall in PA pressure by at least 25%, preferably by 50%, and it should persist like that for about 5 minutes, another 5 minutes. That is what I think. There's a paper by Dr. Krishna Kumar which says that if you do that, then you are likely to make the the differentiation better. That means operable and inoperable. So, but again, having said that, I don't think we have much data on this. Even in their series, when they occluded it, it was not totally black and white. I think some of their patients who were operated continued with pulmonary artery hypertension using the criteria of balloon occlusion that they published. So I think most of the time you will be. I think you have a fair idea depending on the clinical examination, depending on the X-ray, ECG, oximetry, pressures, PVRI, whether you are really dealing with a operable patient or not. So generally, if you take everything into consideration, it's easier to take that decision. Having said that, yes, you get stuck in many cases and you don't know what to do. For them, I have actually a 18-month-old child who was inoperable with a PDA. So we just couldn't believe it. So we put her on sildenafil, etc., and then restarted her 6 months later. She's still inoperable, and she's about, I think, 10 years now or 9 years now, and is doing well. But I just can't think about operating on her because her data was absolutely inoperable even at 18 months. PDAs are the worst. PDAs get Eisenmengerized much earlier than even VSDs.
Achha, what is the age by which we can send the patient directly for surgery without doing any cath?
I would say for VSD, I don't mind till about 2 years if your clinical data is fitting in a non-Downs patient, because Downs patients again tend to have more of pulmonary vascular problems. But for a PDA, I would be a little more worried. Anything above 1 year or anybody above 1 year, I would be critical about it. I'm not saying I'll catheterize this patient, but at least I will be a little more careful before sending this patient for surgery.
Thank you, madam, for the nice.
Ma'am, what is the correct way of giving 100% oxygen in the cath lab? This common question residents are posting. Yeah.
I think we are using either the mask in older kids or a oxygen hood, and we're just sedating them. We are not intubating them or anything, and it's not actually 100%. But there's too much of the recirculation that happens, and therefore the oxygen content. But if you check PO2s, and the PO2s have risen to more than 150, 180, I think we've given good oxygen to them.
When the last patient had a baseline PVRI of around 50, after seeing that value, should we continue? Should we give oxygen study, or should we abandon at this point of time?
See, what happens, Sumod, you don't get PVRI calculation in the lab. And the whole idea of taking him to the lab was to check for operability. He was very minimally desaturated, 93%. So clinically actually pink. So I think we knew that this patient is likely to be inoperable, but you want to give chance to everybody without saying that you don't want to operate or your operation is contraindicated. So once we took him to the lab, once we found that his pressures were very high, we did not have the PVRI value with us at that time, because it's a calculated value, takes time. So it just takes another 10-15 minutes to give them oxygen and do another study. And I think that completes the entire study, and you are much sure of what you're going to do for such patient.
Ma'am, you've shown one administration of supracardiac TAPVC. How will you diagnose other administrations like tricuspid atresia? How do you say this could be tricuspid atresia based on the saturation values?
I think I don't need to do any more because echo is so good. It tells you about tricuspid atresia or any admixture lesion for that matter. But
sometimes they keep oximetry data of tricuspid atresia.
Yes. So for students, when you are given a data sheet or something, then you firstly that you will not have an RV pressure most of the time because you don't tend to enter into RV. Also, your RA pressure will be, if at all, 1 millimeter higher than LA pressure. It can't be less than LA pressure. Then there will be a shunt from right to left, so there will be desaturation in LA. So pulmonary vein may be fully saturated, but LA will be desaturated. And of course, LA saturation will be same as LV, will be same as aorta. So there will be desaturation that way. And if you are shown PA pressure, then PA pressure should be normal. But I think generally it is difficult to enter pulmonary artery in patients with tricuspid atresia if they have severe pulmonary stenosis. If they have a large VSD, then their PA pressures are not so bad. In fact, they may have PAH. In that case, entering pulmonary artery is easier because you can go from LV to RV and to pulmonary artery. We are talking of normally related great arteries situation. But if there is severe PH, this is the classical tricuspid atresia that we tend to see in clinical practice. Tricuspid atresia PS, the VSD tends to be very small in these cases, and therefore entering the RV becomes difficult. So very often in tricuspid atresia, you will either be not given RV pressure, or if you're given, then it will be very low RV pressure. And of course, you cannot say in that case whether there is tricuspid atresia or not, unless somebody tells you the catheter course, that it is from RA to LA to LV to RV. Then you know that it never went from RA to RV.
Echo-based QPQS assessment, is it useful? Should we do or only cath?
We have practically given up echo-based because I think there are studies which say that it correlates well with cardiac catheterization, QPQS, but I somehow feel that it is prone to error because you are assuming too many things, and echo as it is so much dependent on the person who is doing it. So to take that VTI at the right place, unless somebody is really dedicated in doing it for years together, it may be fine. But I think generally speaking, we don't calculate QPQS in our practice by echo, simply because we find it very variable from time to time. So if you really need QPQS, you can look for clinical examination, X-ray, ECG, that will give you a fair idea. But yes, sometimes you have VSDs which are sort of 1.5:1, and you are not sure whether to close them or not close them. You may end up doing their cardiac catheterization to get exact QPQS. But if you're catheterizing somebody for QPQS, please make sure that multiple sets of oximetry are done and not just one, because one can have fallacies. You should have 2 or 3 sets to be very sure whether the step up is real or there is some problem with the technical aspect of it. So multiple sets must be taken to be very sure of QPQS, if that is our primary aim, to catheterize somebody.
Operability in a cyanotic congenital heart disease, increased blood flow, TGA, large VSD, truncus, maybe 2-3 years. How will you say operable or not?
I think they're difficult cases, because by calculating PVRI and all can be very fallacious in lesions like TGA truncus. Truncus is easier because in truncus, the saturation aorta and pulmonary artery are same, considering type 1 truncus or even type 2. And therefore, if you have an aortic saturation of more than 85% or so, you are reasonably certain that this patient will be operable, because the PA saturation is going to be 85 also. So you're going to get a good step up, considering mixed venous to be about 68, 70, there is a step up of 15%. So in truncus, many a times, if your saturations are more than 85 or so, you don't even need to catheterize them. You can straight away send for surgery. If the saturation less than 80, then it is very likely that this patient is inoperable. Yes, 80 to 85, you might have to take them to the lab and do an oxygen study and try and get the PVRI. When it comes to TGA, I think there is a lot of problem, because in TGA, the PA saturation tends to be higher than aortic saturation. But generally speaking, if there is a good aortic saturation, that means aortic saturation is 70% to 75%, such are the patients who are likely to be operable. Generally, a TGA Eisenmenger is much more blue than any other Eisenmenger, or than a TGA straightforward. So anybody who has a TGA VSD and is beyond 1.5 years of age, I think we are stuck to know whether we are keen to know whether this patient is operable or not. And again, we go on the total picture of cardiomegaly, patient in heart failure, plethora on the X-ray, and other features to know whether this patient is operable or not. But you are absolutely right. Getting cardiac care data and calculating these parameters in the presence of a cyanotic heart is difficult. And I think it's less reliable than in a straightforward acyanotic conditions.
In taking a pulmonary capillary wedge pressure data, is there any choice of any particular lobe, or we can take from anywhere?
It's better to take it from the lower lobe, because you are likely to wedge it much better. When you go to the upper lobe, you may not reach the periphery of the lung. Therefore, we tend to get it from the lower lobe. But there should not be any choice, because the patient is lying down. And as long as you can reach the periphery of the lung, or you can occlude that branch of the pulmonary artery so well that your wedge is really reflected in this pressure, in that pressure. So I don't think there should be any choice. But generally, when you're doing it, it tends to get into the lower lobe, and it's better to take it from the lower lobe.
The residents were asking the mechanism of ventricularization of coronary catheter. The LCA catheter got ventricularized. So why does it give ventricularized trace? They want to know.
I think Sai will answer that question, because he answered that. Sai, are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Is there? Yes.
Tell us, why does the pressure look like that of a ventricle?
Ma'am, generally left coronary filling happens in the diastole. So once we hook it there, then probably it almost becomes very much lesser and mimics the diastolic pressure. Because generally the filling is in diastole and we are blocking the diastolic filling.
Yes. So the diastolic becomes almost zero. So it looks like that of a ventricle.
Okay. Thank you so much, ma'am, for an exciting and a wonderful presentation. As always, it's such a pleasure. And thank you so much for agreeing to be the part of this beautiful journey for all of us. And thank you, Dr. Arima. Thank you, Dr. Sumud, for wonderfully moderating the session, and all our young budding cardiologists who are in training and who are joining us from remote and on live panel. Thank you so much. And I have a couple of announcements that next time we have received many requests that because of exams you need some spotters. So we have requested our some eminent cardiologists to come and present some interesting spotters, and we will have many of you again on the panel, so that you get an idea that what kind of spotters are asked in exams, and you can join and understand and interpret those spotters wise. And we'll be presenting that with all exam related material for you. And again, the final announcement that the IJ awards have been launched. I again request that all the final years to please submit your papers, thesis papers on the link, and in large numbers as much as you can. Thank you so much once again, and we'll join you again next Friday, same time. Good evening. Thank you so much.
Mohit, I just want to give one comment.
Yes, ma'am.
That it's a great thing to have some of the students on the panel. I think it makes it much more interesting.
Surely.
For the teacher. So I was very happy that you planned it this way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, and thank you Intas also for supporting us this beautiful initiative. Thanks everybody. Good evening.